The future King of England was caught in an illegal underground brothel, triggering the most desperate, ruthless cover-up in Victorian history. It is a truth universally acknowledged by those of us who observe the corridors of power that the most glittering facades often conceal the most profound rot, and the London of 1889 was a masterclass in this particular brand of gilded hypocrisy. On the surface, the Victorian era was the absolute pinnacle of rigid moral superiority, an empire upon which the sun never set, governed by men of supposedly unimpeachable virtue who preached temperance and piety to the unwashed masses. Yet, beneath the polished cobblestones of the West End, beneath the rustling silk gowns and the rigid starch of formal evening wear, lay a sprawling, subterranean network of vice that catered exclusively to the darkest, most forbidden appetites of the British aristocracy. The air in these hidden parlors was thick with expensive cigars, imported French cologne, and the terrifying thrill of total, unchecked entitlement, serving as a stark and brutal contrast to the crushing, soot-stained poverty that choked the life out of the surrounding East End. It was an era where a gentleman's entire existence was dependent upon his public posture, making the preservation of his most deviant secrets not just a matter of social standing, but an absolute, desperate matter of life, death, and dynastic survival. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe. These videos don't always get recommended, and this way you won't miss the next one. The unraveling of this meticulously constructed web of aristocratic indulgence did not begin with a grand investigation or a crusading moralist, but rather in the profoundly mundane, dust-choked halls of the General Post Office, a sprawling bureaucratic behemoth fueled by the cheap expendable labor of the working classes. Police Constable Luke Hanks had been quietly brought in to investigate a spate of petty thefts, a dreary and entirely routine assignment that typically yielded nothing more than a desperate clerk pocketing a few extra pennies to feed a starving family at home. The atmosphere within the sorting office was one of relentless grinding pressure, an exhausting cacophony of stamping machines, shouting overseers, and the frantic scurrying of boys whose entire livelihoods depended on their ability to move quickly and remain entirely invisible to the gentlemen they served. Constable Hanks, a man undoubtedly weary from dealing with the endless tragic parade of London's poor, was merely looking for a convenient scapegoat, someone to swiftly satisfy the postmaster's demand for order and discipline in an environment constantly teetering on the edge of chaotic destitution. He cast his net into this desperate sea of overworked, underfed youth, completely unaware that he was about to snag a thread that, once pulled, would systematically unravel the moral authority of the entire British ruling class and send absolute panic echoing through the hushed gilded halls of Buckingham Palace. The unfortunate soul caught in Constable Hanks's routine trap was a 15-year-old telegraph messenger named Charles Swinskow, a boy whose life until that precise moment had been defined by the harsh, unforgiving arithmetic of Victorian survival, where a single misstep meant plunging headfirst into the abyss of the workhouse. Upon searching the trembling boy, Hanks discovered the sum of 14 shillings hidden deep within his pockets, an amount so astronomically disproportionate to a messenger's meager weekly wage of merely 11 shillings that it practically screamed of illicit, dangerous activity. To a boy like Charles, 14 shillings was not merely money. It was an absolute fortune, a temporary golden shield against the gnawing hunger and the biting London damp that defined his miserable gray existence. The psychological weight of carrying such staggering wealth must have been absolutely agonizing for the lad, a constant, terrifying reminder of the perilous world he had secretly entered, balanced precariously against the intoxicating relief of finally having heavy coins to rub together in the dark. The sheer impossibility of a working-class boy legitimately acquiring such a sum in a single week instantly transformed Swinskow from a suspected petty thief into a subject of intense, highly suspicious scrutiny, isolating him entirely in a legal system run by men who viewed him as little more than disposable collateral. The interrogation that inevitably followed took place in the sort of grim, claustrophobic room that seems practically designed by the authorities to break the human spirit, smelling faintly of damp wool, cheap tobacco, and the lingering metallic tang of countless prior terrors. As Constable Hanks pressed him relentlessly for the truth, stripping away the boy's pathetic, transparent defenses with the practiced, methodical ruthlessness of a seasoned policeman, Swinskow's initial bravado inevitably shattered into sheer, uncontrollable panic. Charles Swinskow broke down completely, his hot tears cutting clean tracks through the London grime on his face as the heavy, suffocating guilt of a working-class boy caught in the terrifying machinery of rich men's vices completely overwhelmed his fragile resolve. He knew, with the sharp, innate survival instinct of the deeply impoverished, that he was entirely ruined, and that the fine gentlemen who had paid him for his silence and his services would instantly vanish back into their luxurious guarded townhouses, leaving him to face the brutal, crushing weight of the Victorian justice system entirely alone. In that gaslit gloom, the agonizing reality of his situation crystallized with brutal clarity. He was not a participant in high society's secret games, but merely a temporary rented plaything, easily purchased and even more easily discarded when the authorities inevitably came knocking at the door. Through his ragged sobs, the broken telegraph boy finally uttered the words that would ignite the most explosive, deeply buried scandal of the 19th century, confessing that he had earned the 14 shillings not by stealing from Her Majesty's post office, but by repeatedly visiting a certain discreet house situated on Cleveland Street. The moment the boy detailed the specific nature of his employment there, describing the wealthy aristocratic gentleman who frequented the velvet-draped establishment under the heavy cover of darkness, the entire atmosphere of the dreary interrogation room shifted from routine policing to something infinitely more sinister. A source within the inner circle of the constabulary later noted that the immediate realization of what this weeping boy was describing sent a very real, physical chill down the spines of the investigating officers, as they instantly grasped the catastrophic political implications of an underground male brothel catering exclusively to the highest echelons of the British elite. This was no longer a trivial matter of 14 shillings and a wayward youth. This was a live stick of dynamite placed directly beneath the very foundations of the establishment, a terrifying glimpse into a secret world where powerful men satisfied their most forbidden lusts while publicly demanding absolute moral purity from everyone else. The unintended, disastrous domino effect had officially begun, and a poor, terrified boy's frantic confession was about to summon a vicious storm of panic, blackmail, and desperate aristocratic cover-ups that would ultimately reach the very footsteps of the royal family itself. The raid on number 19 Cleveland Street was not the standard bludgeoning police action one might expect in the rougher quarters of Whitechapel. It was a delicate, almost surgical intrusion into a world that should not have existed. Leading the charge was Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline, a man whose very name carried the weary, cynical weight of a London that had seen too much, having only recently stepped away from the grisly, unsolved nightmare of the Jack the Ripper murders. As he stood before the unassuming brick facade of the house, Aberline must have felt a profound sense of déjà vu, realizing that while he had spent months hunting a monster in the gutters of the East End, he was now hunting a different kind of beast, one that wore bespoke tailoring and spoke with the honeyed tones of Oxford and Cambridge. The atmosphere in the street was heavy with the stagnant, sulphurous smell of coal smoke and the muffled clatter of distant carriages, a quiet that felt unnervingly artificial, as if the very buildings were holding their breath in anticipation of the scandal about to burst forth. Aberline's eyes, seasoned by years of witnessing the absolute worst of human nature, likely scanned the darkened windows of Cleveland Street with a cold professional detachment, knowing full well that the monsters of high society were often far more dangerous and elusive than the desperate killers of the slums. Inside the house, the scene was a grotesque parody of a gentleman's club, a claustrophobic maze of plush velvet draperies, heavy mahogany furniture, and the lingering, cloying scent of expensive French cologne that seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence. This was the domain of Charles Hammond, the brothel keeper, a man who had built a thriving illicit empire by catering to the most repressed and dangerous impulses of the Victorian elite. When the police finally breached the doors, the silence was shattered not by a struggle, but by the frantic, high-pitched rustle of silk and the desperate thud of retreating footsteps as the inhabitants scrambled to find an exit. Hammond himself, a man whose survival depended on his ability to anticipate the shifting winds of authority, managed to vanish into the thick London fog with a speed that suggested he had been tipped off long before the first boot hit the floor. A well-meaning staff member within the constabulary, perhaps motivated by a misplaced sense of loyalty to the old guard or a simple cold-blooded bribe, had ensured the mastermind escaped, leaving behind only the low-level participants to face the music of the law. Caught in the net was Henry Newlove, an 18-year-old clerk whose youthful face was a mask of sheer, paralyzing terror as the reality of his situation began to sink in. Newlove was not a seasoned criminal or a hardened deviant. He was a young man of modest means who had been seduced by the promise of easy money and the proximity to power that the Cleveland Street house offered. As he was led away in handcuffs, the sheer crushing weight of the Victorian moral code must have felt like a physical burden, a realization that his life, his reputation, and his future were now entirely at the mercy of a legal system that had no room for indecent mistakes. The air in the house, once filled with the hushed whispers of forbidden trysts, was now thick with the sterile metallic smell of police lanterns and the grim, rhythmic scratching of inspectors' nibs as they catalogued the evidence of a secret world. Newlove's frantic desperation was palpable, a stark contrast to the cold, methodical efficiency of the officers who were already beginning to uncover the names of the men who had paid for his presence in those velvet-draped rooms. The psychological pressure on Newlove during his initial detention was immense, a calculated campaign of isolation and intimidation designed to make him feel that his only hope for leniency lay in total, unvarnished confession. He sat in a cold, dimly lit cell, the silence occasionally broken by the harsh, echoing clang of iron doors and the distant muffled cries of other prisoners, a constant reminder of the abyss that awaited him. In his mind, he must have replayed every encounter, every whispered promise of protection from his wealthy patrons, realizing with a sickening jolt that those promises were as hollow as the moral platitudes they spouted in public. The realization that he was merely a pawn in a much larger, more dangerous game of shadows and influence must have been devastating, stripping away his last vestiges of youthful naivety. He was a clerk who had dared to touch the sun of the aristocracy, and now he was being burned by the very heat he had sought to bask in, a classic Victorian tragedy of ambition and exploitation. As the investigation deepened, Scotland Yard began to realize that they had not merely stumbled upon a common house of ill repute, but had instead stepped directly onto a massive, politically charged landmine. The names being whispered by the frightened boys and the evidence being gathered from Hammond's abandoned ledgers pointed toward a reality that was almost too scandalous to contemplate. Each new revelation brought with it a fresh wave of anxiety for the police leadership, who found themselves caught between their duty to uphold the law and their intrinsic fear of the powerful men who sat above them. The air in the commissioner's office was likely thick with the tension of men who knew they were holding a secret that could topple governments and ruin the most prestigious families in the land. The realization was dawning. They weren't just investigating a crime, they were beginning the process of unearthing a rot that went all the way to the core of the British establishment, a process that would require a level of ruthlessness and deception that would make even the most hardened detective shudder. Under the flickering, rhythmic hiss of the gaslight in the interrogation room, the silence was finally punctured by the sound of a name that made the collective blood of Scotland Yard run cold: Lord Arthur Somerset. As Henry Newlove began to sing to avoid the cold iron of a prison cell, he didn't just mention a few errant clerks. He unleashed a torrent of aristocratic titles that stripped the veneer of respectability from the very heart of the British establishment. Somerset, an equerry to the Prince of Wales and a man who moved in the most rarefied circles of the Marlborough house set, was not just a visitor. He was allegedly a regular fixture at 19 Cleveland Street. The psychological impact on the investigating officers was profound, a sickening lurch of the stomach as they realized they were no longer chasing shadows in the fog, but were now staring directly into the faces of the men who quite literally ran the country. The air in the room seemed to thin, becoming suffocatingly heavy with the unspoken realization that a single misplaced word in their reports could result in the immediate and total destruction of their own careers. The Earl of Euston's name followed, dragging one of the most ancient and respected titles in the peerage into the muck of the Cleveland Street gutters. In the mind of Lord Arthur Somerset, the news of the police raid must have triggered a frantic, paralyzed state of fight or flight, a desperate internal monologue weighing the possibility of a dignified exit against the absolute, crushing certainty of social annihilation. He was a man who had spent his life navigating the intricate, unwritten rules of the court, a world where appearance was everything, and a single stain on one's character was an irreversible death sentence. The atmosphere surrounding him in those days of late 1889 must have been one of agonizing paranoia. Every sideways glance from a fellow club member or a slightly too long pause from a servant feeling like a sharpened blade aimed directly at his throat. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, watching as the walls of his privileged existence began to crumble under the weight of a secret he could no longer contain. Inside the sterile, wood-paneled offices of the high-ranking police officials, the mood was one of grim, desperate calculation rather than a pursuit of justice. The written depositions, filled with the sordid details of Somerset's and Euston's visits, sat on the desks like unexploded ordnance, radiating a danger that threatened to incinerate anyone who dared to handle them with too much transparency. There was an invisible, crushing weight to the British class system that seemed to descend upon the investigators, a silent command from the very top that the natural order must be preserved at any cost. Every officer in that room knew that the law was a firm, unyielding hand for the poor, but for the aristocracy, it was expected to be a soft, discreet glove that smoothed over indiscretions with a quiet cough and a turned head. The long-term consequences of this systemic hesitation were already taking root, creating a culture of state-sponsored deception that would protect the powerful while leaving the vulnerable, like the messenger boys, to be ground into the dirt by the very wheels of justice they had supposedly helped turn. The aristocratic reaction to the emerging leaks was not one of shame, but of a cold, arrogant closing of ranks that bordered on the sociopathic. Behind the heavy, soundproof doors of Mayfair townhouses, the conversation was not about the morality of the acts, but about the inconvenience of the discovery and the necessity of silencing the scum who had dared to speak. This wasn't a matter of individual guilt. It was a collective defense of the tribe, a belief that the reputation of the peerage was far more important than the truth or the lives of the young men they had exploited. The pressure on the government to intervene became a physical force, a series of hushed meetings and gentlemen's agreements designed to ensure that the most damaging names had never reached the public record. It was a masterclass in the ruthless preservation of power, an early prototype of the modern spin that seeks to bury the inconvenient under a mountain of procedural delays and strategic distractions. By the time the Director of Public Prosecutions was fully briefed, the rot had reached a level where a simple trial was no longer a viable option for the state. A source behind closed doors later whispered that the sheer volume of evidence against the high-born regulars was so overwhelming that it threatened to turn any courtroom into a theater of the absurd, where the foundations of Victorian morality would be publicly shredded. The long-term consequence of this specific moment in the scandal was the birth of a profound, lingering public cynicism regarding the impartiality of the law, a realization that the old boys' network was not a conspiracy theory, but a functional, lethal reality of British life. The stage was now set for the ultimate revelation, the one name that would transform a high society scandal into an existential threat to the very throne of England itself, leaving the investigators trembling at the edge of a precipice from which there was no safe return. The ultimate revelation, the name that turned a high society scandal into a national emergency, was P.A.V., Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, affectionately known within the family as Eddie. As the second in line to the throne, Eddie was the living embodiment of the monarchy's future. Yet he was a young man whose inner life was a tapestry of profound isolation and a paralyzing sense of inadequacy. A source behind closed doors often whispered that Eddie was a dawdler, a man of slow intellect and soft character who felt the crushing weight of his grandmother, Queen Victoria's expectations like a physical shroud. The psychological pressure of being the spare who became the heir after his father was immense. Eddie knew he was being watched, judged, and found wanting at every turn. In the illicit sanctuary of Cleveland Street, perhaps he felt for the first time a sense of belonging away from the icy, judgmental gaze of the court, a tragic, misplaced search for intimacy that would ultimately lead to his near destruction. The atmosphere within Marlborough House, the residence of the Prince of Wales, shifted instantly from one of opulence to one of suffocating high-voltage panic. When the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, was informed of his son's alleged involvement, his reaction was described by someone close to palace circles as a volcanic, vein-popping rage fueled by a terrifying realization. The scandal could end the Windsor dynasty before the 20th century even began. The long-term consequences of such a leak were unthinkable. If the public learned that the future king was frequenting a male brothel, the fragile social contract between the crown and the people would be shredded in an afternoon. The Prince of Wales, a man who was certainly no stranger to his own discreet indiscretions, was nonetheless horrified by the sheer sloppiness of his son's choices, seeing in Eddie's actions a reckless disregard for the survival of the institution they both served. Behind the heavy gold-leaf doors of the royal apartments, the air grew thick with the frantic whispered strategy of men who had spent their lives perfecting the art of the gray area. The palace insiders didn't just worry about the legal ramifications, they were terrified of the blackmail potential. If Lord Arthur Somerset, who was already under immense pressure, decided to name the prince to save his own skin, the monarchy would be held hostage by its own equerry. This created a claustrophobic environment of mutual suspicion and absolute ruthlessness. Every letter was intercepted, every visitor was vetted, and the very walls seemed to have ears as the establishment scrambled to build a firewall around the young prince. The psychological toll on the family was devastating, as the warmth of familial bonds was replaced by the cold, calculating logic of a damage control, turning the royal household into a fortress of silence. The pressure exerted by the palace on the government was silent, invisible, and completely absolute. This wasn't a request for help. It was a demand for the total erasure of any evidence linking the Duke of Clarence to the house on Cleveland Street. The surrounding atmosphere in Whitehall became one of complicit dread, as officials realized they were being asked to subvert the very laws they were sworn to uphold in order to protect a young man who was, by many accounts, a liability to the crown. The long-term consequence of this intervention was the cementing of a deep state mentality within the British government, a belief that some truths are simply too dangerous for the public to handle. This culture of concealment would go on to protect royal miscreants for generations, creating a blueprint for the men in gray suits who still manage the family's image with an iron fist today. As the rumors began to leak into the more salacious rags of the day, the palace's desperation reached a fever pitch, necessitating a distraction of monumental proportions. It is quite fascinating, in a cynical sense, to observe how the establishment's first instinct is always to hide the body rather than address the crime. While the public was being fed sanitized stories of royal duties and charitable endeavors, the inner circle was orchestrating a massive, expensive silencing campaign. They knew that if the Prince Eddie story broke in full, the resulting explosion would make the current, rather tedious complaints of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle look like a minor squabble over a seating chart. The stakes in 1889 were not about hurt feelings or my truth. They were about the literal survival of the British throne. And as the shadow of Cleveland Street grew longer, the palace prepared to take measures that were as ruthless as they were effective. The burden of managing this radioactive secret eventually landed on the desk of the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury. a man whose statesmanlike exterior masked the heart of a cold-blooded pragmatist. For Salisbury, the Cleveland Street scandal wasn't a moral crisis. It was a structural threat to the British Empire that required a surgical, if entirely corrupt, solution. One can only imagine the inner monologue of such a man, balancing the survival of the monarchy against the potential for a populist uprising if the public ever realized that the law was being bent into a pretzel to shield a royal prince. The atmosphere in his office at 10 Downing Street would have been stifling, filled with the heavy scent of old parchment and the unspoken understanding that truth was a luxury the government simply could not afford. Salisbury's calculation was simple. The individual lives of a few telegraph boys and the integrity of the police force were minor sacrifices compared to the stability of the crown. This was the era where the establishment truly learned how to weaponize silence, creating a legacy of state-sponsored deception that remains the blueprint for royal crisis management to this day. It is, quite frankly, impossible to look at this level of existential peril without drawing a somewhat cynical comparison to the scandals that occupy our headlines today. When one considers the calculated life-or-death stakes faced by the palace in 1889, the modern-day grievances emanating from the sun-drenched hills of Montecito feel rather like a tempest in a very expensive organic teapot. We are currently subjected to a relentless stream of truths from Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, complaints about cramped cottages, frosty receptions, and the supposed trauma of being told no. One can almost hear the ghost of Lord Salisbury scoffing at the sheer self-indulgent indulgence of it all. In the Victorian era, exile meant being shipped across the world to a malaria-ridden outpost to save the throne. Today, it apparently means signing multi-million-dollar deals with streaming giants while weeping about one's lack of security. There's a certain irony in the fact that while the Victorian royals were desperately trying to stay out of the papers to save the monarchy, the modern exiles seem desperate to stay in them to save their brand. It is a shift from the ruthless preservation of an institution to the relentless promotion of the self, and one can't help but find the latter profoundly exhausting by comparison. The long-term consequences of Lord Salisbury's intervention were felt most acutely by the men who actually attempted to do their jobs. The Director of Public Prosecutions and the senior officials at Scotland Yard found themselves in the humiliating position of having to actively stall the legal machinery they were supposed to operate. There was a palpable pressure from the very top to delay the issuing of arrest warrants for Lord Arthur Somerset and his high-born associates, effectively giving them a gentleman's window of several weeks to pack their bags and flee the country. The surrounding atmosphere in the legal corridors was one of shameful complicity. Everyone knew why the wheels were turning so slowly, yet no one dared to speak the name of the prince who was the real reason for the delay. This wasn't just a failure of justice, it was a deliberate top-down dismantling of the rule of law to protect a bloodline, a maneuver that left the police force demoralized and the public increasingly suspicious of the impartial British justice system. A well-placed source within the political circles of the time later hinted that the tension between Salisbury and the Prince of Wales reached a breaking point during this period. The Prince of Wales was reportedly furious that the government couldn't simply make the entire problem vanish overnight, while Salisbury was acutely aware that if they were too blatant in their cover-up, they risked a scandal that could trigger a Republican movement. The inner monologue of the future King Edward VII was likely one of wounded pride and aristocratic entitlement. He expected the Prime Minister to act as his personal janitor, scrubbing away the filth his son had stepped in. This dynamic highlights the fundamental arrogance of the era, the belief that the monarchy didn't just sit above the law, but that the law existed primarily as a tool to be used or discarded based on royal convenience. The surrounding atmosphere of London in the autumn of 1889 became a tinderbox of rumors and half-truths. While the official press remained largely silent, muzzled by libel laws and a sense of patriotic duty, the underground pamphlets and radical broadsides began to piece together the puzzle. The pressure on the government to act was mounting, but every move they made was designed to be a dead end. They were playing a high-stakes game of hide the aristocrat, ensuring that by the time the police were finally allowed to move on the Cleveland Street house again, The bird, and more importantly, the prince's equerry, had long since flown. The long-term consequence of this charade was a deepening chasm between the classes, as the working man watched the wealthy escape into the night while the poor boys involved were left to face the full, unmitigated wrath of Victorian morality. As the warrants were finally signed, far too late to be of any actual use, the government prepared for the next stage of the theater, the public prosecution of the small fry. It was a classic diversionary tactic designed to give the appearance of action while the true culprits were safely ensconced in continental hotels. The stage was set for a series of trials that would be more about protecting names than uncovering truth, proving once and for all that in the eyes of the British state, a royal secret is worth 1,000 shattered lives. The audacity of the British upper crust is truly a marvel to behold, particularly when they are backed into a corner of their own making. As the scandal simmered, the Earl of Euston, a man whose lineage was as thick as his skin, decided that the best defense was a blistering high-stakes offense. While Lord Arthur Somerset had the good sense to flee to the continent, Euston chose to stand his ground, launching a libel suit against the journalist Ernest Park, who had dared to link his name to the Cleveland Street Den. Euston's defense was nothing short of comical, a masterpiece of aristocratic gaslighting that would have been funny if the stakes weren't so tragically high. He claimed, with a straight face and a trembling lip of feigned indignation, that he had only entered the house because he had been handed a card for posy plastiques, an art form involving stationary, scantily clad models, and had wandered in out of a purely aesthetic curiosity. He maintained that upon realizing the true, vile nature of the establishment, he had turned on his heel and left in a state of utter moral revulsion. The inner monologue of the Earl during his testimony must have been a frantic dance of sheer, unadulterated arrogance and cold terror. He was banking entirely on the fact that a Victorian jury would find it inconceivable that a man of his station would lie under oath, even when the truth was staring them in the face. The atmosphere in the courtroom was stifling, a thick, cloying heat generated by the press of bodies and the oppressive weight of the legal institution. It was a theater of the absurd, where the gallery was packed with the Earl's peers, their presence a silent, menacing reminder to the jury of the social order they were expected to uphold. Euston's performance was a masterclass in the noble lie, his voice steady even as his reputation hung by a thread, demonstrating a level of sociopathic detachment that only centuries of unearned privilege can provide. For the journalist Ernest Park, the atmosphere was one of cold, creeping dread as he realized the system was systematically rigging the game against him. Park was a man of principle, a radical who believed that the truth should be a universal currency, yet he found himself in a courtroom where the truth was being treated as a hazardous substance. The pressure from the bench was palpable. The judge, a man clearly aware of the delicate nature of the case, steered the proceedings with a heavy hand, ensuring that any mention of the higher-ranking figures, specifically the Prince of Wales's circle, was suppressed with ruthless efficiency. Park watched in silent despair as his witnesses were intimidated and his evidence was dismissed as hearsay, realizing too late that in the eyes of the British law, a journalist's duty to the public was nothing compared to the state's duty to protect its own. The long-term consequences of this specific legal farce were devastating for the freedom of the press in Britain. When the jury, cowed by the weight of the establishment, found in favor of the Earl of Euston, Ernest Park was sentenced to 12 months of hard labor. It was a chilling message to anyone who dared to look too closely at the private lives of the elite. The truth is no defense against the wrath of a humiliated aristocrat. A source behind closed doors later remarked that the Euston victory was toasted in every club in St. James's, not because they believed him, but because he had successfully re-established the boundary between the rulers and the ruled. The journalist went to a cold, damp cell for the crime of being right, while the Earl returned to his estates, his public honor vindicated by a system that preferred a polished lie to a messy reality. This victory, however, was a hollow one for the monarchy. While the Earl of Euston had provided a convenient shield, the whispers regarding Prince Eddie refused to quiet down. The surrounding atmosphere in London remained toxic, a mixture of bitter working-class resentment and middle-class hypocrisy. The public knew they were being lied to, and that knowledge began to erode the unquestioning deference that had sustained the crown for centuries. The long-term damage was an invisible rot in the floorboards of the palace. They had saved the prince's name for now, but at the cost of the public's soul. The establishment had won the battle in the courtroom, but they were losing the war for the moral high ground, a precarious position that would eventually force them into their most desperate maneuver yet, the literal banishment of the heir to the far reaches of the empire. One must admire, in a rather morbid fashion, the sheer unsentimental efficiency of Queen Victoria when it came to the preservation of the firm. While the public was told that Prince Albert Victor, our dear dawdling Eddie, was embarking on a grand tour of India to broaden his horizons and strengthen imperial bonds, the reality was far more akin to a polite, gilded deportation. A long-time family acquaintance once remarked that the Queen's directive was as sharp and final as a guillotine. The boy had to be removed from the reach of the London press and the clutching hands of the Cleveland Street investigators before the ink on the warrants had even dried. There was no room for grandmotherly affection in the cold, calculating rooms of Windsor. There was only the grim necessity of distance. The atmosphere surrounding his departure was not one of celebration, but of a quiet, frantic relief, a sense that the palace was finally putting an ocean between itself and a scandal that threatened to drown them all in the London mud. For Prince Eddie, the inner monologue as he stood on the deck of the HMS Osborne must have been one of profound, hollow melancholy, a realization that he was being discarded by the very family he was destined to lead. He was a man being sent into a tropical exile, forced to trade the familiar gaslit comforts of his London clubs for the blinding, relentless sun of the Raj, all to serve as a living distraction for a public that was beginning to ask too many questions. One can imagine the weight of that silence on the long voyage south, the rhythmic mechanical thud of the engines echoing the repetitive circular thoughts of a man who knew he was a disappointment to his father and a problem for his grandmother. He was not a conqueror or a statesman. He was a liability in a naval uniform, a prince whose primary duty was now to simply disappear for long enough that the name Cleveland Street would fade into a mere whisper in the backrooms of the West End. The psychological toll of being a human shield for the monarchy's reputation is a burden few could carry without breaking, yet Eddie carried it with that same vacant, drifting obedience that had defined his entire tragic life. The surrounding atmosphere in India was a fever dream of forced pageantry and suffocating heat, a meticulously choreographed performance designed to keep the prince too busy for trouble and too visible for rumors. From Bombay to Calcutta, he was paraded before Maharajas and colonial officials, a pale, tired figurehead draped in heavy ceremonial robes that must have felt like a leaden shroud in the blistering humidity. Behind the scenes, however, the pressure on his handlers was immense. They were not just organizing a tour, they were managing a prisoner of state, ensuring that every interaction was scripted and every moment of privacy was monitored to prevent any further indiscretions. The long-term consequence of this charade was the perfection of the royal tour as a weapon of mass distraction, a tactic we see employed to this day whenever the family needs to move the goalposts of public discourse. It was in the dust of India that the palace learned that if you give the people enough bunting and brass bands, they will eventually stop looking for the bodies buried under the floorboards of the capital. It is quite amusing, in a rather weary way, to contrast this genuine, state-ordered banishment with the performative exile currently being staged in the manicured suburbs of California. We are often asked to pity Prince Harry and Meghan Markle for their supposed escape from the clutches of the British press, yet their version of exile involves lucrative production deals and a relentless global media tour to discuss their own victimhood. One suspects that if Prince Eddie had possessed a fraction of their talent for self-promotion, he might have spent his 7 months in India filming a documentary about the trauma of being asked to leave a brothel. Instead, the Victorians understood the value of a dignified, forced silence, a concept that seems entirely lost on the modern residents of Montecito, who appear to believe that privacy is something one achieves by shouting into a megaphone at every available opportunity. The skepticism one feels toward the modern duo is only sharpened when viewed against the backdrop of real royal history, where being sent away wasn't a choice made for wellness, but a survival tactic used to prevent a revolution. The pressure on the home front didn't let up just because the prince was thousands of miles away. If anything, his absence made the rumors grow taller and more twisted. While Eddie was shooting tigers and attending durbars, the London papers, those that weren't under the thumb of the establishment, began to link his sudden departure to the darker whispers of the Jack the Ripper murders. The palace had traded one nightmare for another. By hiding the prince to solve the Cleveland Street problem, they had inadvertently fueled the fires of an even more grisly conspiracy theory. The atmosphere in the London clubs became toxic with speculation, a sense that if the heir was being hidden so thoroughly, his crimes must be far worse than mere indecency. This was the long-term price of the cover-up. By refusing to face the truth of 1889, the monarchy allowed a cloud of suspicion to hang over Prince Eddie that would never truly dissipate, even after he was long in his grave. As the tour drew to its exhausted conclusion in the spring of 1890, the prince returned to a Britain that had changed, yet remained stubbornly the same. The Cleveland Street house was empty, the boys were in prison or forgotten, and the aristocrats were slowly creeping back from their continental retreats, confident that the storm had passed. But for Eddie, the return was not a homecoming. It was merely a transition to a different kind of confinement within the rigid structures of the court. The long-term consequence of his Indian solution was a man who was more isolated and scrutinized than ever before, a prince whose every move was now viewed through the lens of a scandal that had been suppressed but never resolved. The stage was being set for the final tragic act of his life, a sudden, convenient death that would finally provide the palace with the permanent silence they had been so desperately seeking since that first knock on the door at number 19. The year 1892 brought with it a resolution to the Prince Eddie problem that no amount of diplomatic banishment or legal maneuvering could have achieved: a final, permanent silence. Just as the palace was breathing a cautious sigh of relief, having successfully orchestrated his engagement to Princess Mary of Teck to tether his wandering reputation to the mast of domestic respectability, the great influenza epidemic swept through the drafty corridors of Sandringham. For Prince Eddie, the inner monologue as he lay in that fevered delirium must have been a chaotic blur of the heavy Indian sun, the hushed, terrified whispers of Cleveland Street, and the suffocating weight of a crown he was never truly meant to wear. There is a profound, almost Shakespearean tragedy in the fact that a man who had been the subject of the most elaborate state cover-up in history was ultimately undone by a microscopic germ. A source within the inner circle at the time remarked that as the prince's breathing grew ragged, the atmosphere in the sick room was a complex, jarring mixture of genuine parental grief and a cold, unspoken relief among the courtiers who knew that the Eddie problem was being solved by Providence in a way that left the monarchy's dignity intact. The funeral that followed was a masterpiece of Victorian theater, a sea of black crepe and solemn pageantry that served as the final layer of dirt over the secrets of 1889. As the coffin was lowered into the vault at St. George's Chapel, the atmosphere was one of heavy artificial mourning, masking the reality that a massive looming liability had been neutralized. The long-term consequence of Eddie's death was the sudden elevation of his younger brother, the future George V, a man of significantly sterner stuff who would guide the monarchy through the terrors of the Great War. Yet, for those who knew the truth of the Cleveland Street raid, the funeral was less about burying a prince and more about burying the evidence of a rot that had nearly toppled the throne. The palace could finally close the ledger on the Duke of Clarence, secure in the knowledge that a dead prince is much easier to manage than a living one, with a penchant for the forbidden. It is the ultimate irony of the British establishment that they are never more protective of a royal's reputation than when they are delivering the eulogy. The legacy of the Cleveland Street cover-up did not die with the prince, however. It hardened into a lethal legal precedent that would soon claim a much more brilliant victim. The absolute success the government had in suppressing the scandal and protecting high-born sodomites emboldened the legal system to turn its gaze toward those without royal protection, leading directly to the brutal public crucifixion of Oscar Wilde just 3 years later. The atmosphere of moral crusade that gripped London in the mid-1890s was a direct reaction to the indecency they had been forced to ignore during the Cleveland Street affair. Having let the earls and the princes escape through the back door, the state felt a desperate need to reassert its moral authority by crushing a poet. The long-term consequence was a century of state-sanctioned homophobia, born from the guilt and hypocrisy of a ruling class that had looked the other way for one of its own while preparing the gallows for the rest. In the final analysis, the Cleveland Street scandal remains a chilling testament to the lengths the British monarchy will go to ensure its own survival. It was a moment when the mask of Victorian virtue slipped, revealing a face of cold, calculating ruthlessness that prioritized the bloodline over the law, the truth, or the lives of the vulnerable. Today, as we watch the modern iterations of royal drama, the endless tiresome PR volleys from California, and the carefully curated social media posts of the working royals, it is worth remembering that the stakes used to be infinitely higher. While the current generation squabbles over who gets to wear which tiara or who leaked a story to a tabloid, their ancestors were busy burying evidence of illegal brothels and shipping heirs across the globe to save the crown. The monarchy survives not through its perfection, but through its ability to outlast its own scandals, weaving a narrative of continuity over a history filled with remarkably inconvenient truths. When we peer behind the curtain of history, we find that the shadows are often more revealing than the spotlights. The story of Prince Eddie and the house on Cleveland Street is a reminder that power, when threatened, has no room for sentimentality or justice. It only has room for the next day's survival. It has been quite a journey through the fog of Victorian London, and I find myself wondering if we have truly changed all that much, or if we have simply become better at dressing up our scandals in more palatable, modern clothing. Leave your thoughts below. I read every word you write, and I am keen to know if you see the same patterns of privilege and silence repeating in our own time. And if you value this unvarnished, perhaps slightly cynical look at the mechanics of the monarchy, do ensure you are subscribed and share this with those who appreciate the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your skepticism sharp.